Good morning, everyone. I think we'll start now. This was always going to be a hard gig. Thank you. Grateful everyone could be seated. Thank you. Welcome to the Economic Update. Really delighted to see so many participants here in person, but also online, and obviously that's a real credit to the organisers from the ANU's Indonesia project. My name's Jonathan Gilbert, and I'm the Director of the Indonesia Economic and Trade section at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and next year I'll be heading up to Jakarta to lead our economic investment and infrastructure branch at the embassy there. Really delighted and honoured to be able to chair this economic update this year, and very much looking forward to the presentations by Pak Arianto and Ibu Masyita. As many of you are aware, it's been a very busy few weeks in Jakarta with obviously the ASEAN-related summits and the visit by our Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. And it's no surprise to see that Jakarta was the venue for the launch by Prime Minister Albanese of Australia's Southeast Asian Economic Strategy to 2040, a report to the Australian Government by Special Envoy for Southeast Asia, Nicholas Moore. And there's obviously lots going on in the Australia-Indonesia economic space, and I have to say, so pleasing to see the strong levels of engagement, particularly over the past 18 months, by both sides, and just how important this is in terms of the bilateral relationship. Today, I'm very pleased that we have Pak Arianto join us to deliver his presentation on trade policy in Indonesia, and I'll have him introduce that shortly. Pak Arianto is a fellow at the ANU's Department of Economics since 2012, and a long-standing member of the ANU Indonesia project. His current research is focused on trade and development, and he's written in publications such as the East Asia Forum, Jakarta Post, Kompas, and Tempo. And joining Pak Arianto is Ibu Masyita, who currently serves as Special Advisor to the Minister of Finance on macroeconomic and fiscal policy, and is also a spokesperson for Indonesia's newly formed sovereign wealth fund, the Indonesia Investment Authority, an organisation that the Department of Foreign Affairs has been working with quite closely alongside Australian institutional investors. Ibu Masyita is an ANU alumna, having completed her master's degree in international development economics. So great to have both of you presenting in person, and thank you, Ibu, for making the trip from Jakarta to Canberra and joining us here today in person. So without further ado, I'd like to call on Pak Arianto to begin his presentation, and looking forward to an engaged Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Selamat pagi. It's a pleasure to be here again, but I feel bad that I'm taking you from very interesting politics to dry and boring economics, so please bear with me. As Jonathan said, that my topic is about trade policy in Indonesia, so I'll briefly review some recent development in the economy before zooming in to trade policy. So, okay, let me start with summary. So if you feel asleep, you don't miss much, right? So first one, of course, the global economy is slowly recovering, but there are still some pressures, right? But Indonesia's economy is quite sound, actually. But we also hear that the government aspires Indonesia to become a high-income country by 2045. That's the 100th birthday of Indonesia, right? So it needs to grow faster than that to become a high-income country by that target, 2045. And in this paper, I argue that one way to achieve that is through increased trade activities. But there are some problems, and one of which is the protectionism still there. It even increases recently. And in the paper, I discussed this, and I characterize this approach as being a mixed bag of pragmatism, ambivalence, and nationalism. And then I will end the discussion with a call for improving productivity and logistics infrastructures as a key to support further integration to global value chain. Okay, so that's the summary. And yeah, so the outline for this today's presentation, again, I will review some development in global economy, going into macro economy in Indonesia, and then trade development and policy in Indonesia. I will show some trends, and then I will demonstrate how protectionism has increased again, and also pair that to the fact that Indonesia is still having very low participation in the global value chains, unfortunately. And then many of you have heard about this current strategy called hilirisasi or downstreaming. I will focus on that too. And then two other recent development in trade policy, and that is the relationship with the WTO, and also at the same time proliferation of other trade agreements under Joko Widodo's presidency. And the last one, maybe not many of you have heard, and there is this new development where Indonesia now is implementing what they call neraca komoditas, or balance sheet approach to trade. Right? So that's a part of the presentation today. It's not working. Okay, so start with, for the global landscape, we see that in the US, in Europe, and even in Australia, inflation is starting to slow down, but probably the interest rates might stay high, right? Even the inflation slowing down are sticky in many parts of the world. So we hear issues like whether or not it's going to be a soft landing or hard landing. We don't often hear that debate in Indonesia, because as I will show you later, the inflation is quite tamed in Indonesia, unlike in other countries, right? In China, it's the other way. We're seeing economic slowdown, right? They even have deflation. Just last week, they started to go back to positive territory, even though very close to zero, right? But they are slowing down. And there are still some rising tensions in the US. In response to the high inflation, the Biden administration implemented this IRA, or Inflation Reduction Act, many of which actually is has very protectionist content, and it creates tension with US trade partners, including Indonesia. So probably some of you have heard that Indonesia is trying to get a mini FTA deal with the US to secure the flow of nickel to US under this IRA. Okay? And then we also see some tension with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative versus decoupling from other countries, or what some people say, China plus one. China plus one being you have your economic activity in China, but now you want to add at least one other country to reduce the risk. So that's why it's called de-risking as well. And then recently we also see in the news about BRICS, the group of countries. It's not quite formal, but they already have a bank they call a New Development Bank, formerly known as BRICS Development Bank. But even in this one, we have seen some cracks, right, between China and India. For example, Xi Jinping didn't attend the G20 meeting in India. And other issues that still affect the global landscape is, for example, there is still tension in Ukraine, and as well, now Indonesia starting to have the impact of El Nino. So in the rest of the year, I think they will be very serious in dealing with El Nino, especially as it can raise the price of food, in addition to India's banning the rice recently. Okay. Oh, this is good now. So let's start with macroeconomic development. Is it not full, Sita? So for some long-run look for the economic growth, I deliberately used this long series to show you that basically the pandemic is behind us already, right? So the last quarter we have 5.2% growth, which is the same as last quarter of 2018. Right, so, and also you can see in the graph that actually the impact of COVID is less than half the impact of what we had in the Asian financial crisis. So it's over, but you can see again for 20 years, the average is around just 5%. That's not enough if Indonesia wants to achieve its target to become high-income country, right? As far as inflation is concerned, you can see Indonesia, there is the black bold line. It's in the middle. That means quite tamed. There are some countries that hit 8% of inflation, but China there, the lowest line, the purple one, actually had deflation. It means the inflation is below zero. So it's been quite manageable in Indonesia. And rupiah is it's very stable actually. So this is rupiah against US dollar and rupiah against yuan or renminbi. Again, they are very stable. Even in the stock market, you can see again, there is very a low volatility. So it's quite stable compared to the stock index in US, in Hong Kong, in Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand, right? There is some note actually for the macro indicator, and this is on the state budget. We can see here that energy subsidy comes big again, right? So the red numbers there is the energy's expenditure as percentage of central government expenditure. It increases again, and much of this goes to the fuel subsidy. So it's unfortunate because Jokowi came to power. When Jokowi first took office in 2014, he was applauded because one of the first reforms that he did was to remove the fuel subsidy, right? But now he's leaving office with quite a big subsidy again. And it's quite big compared to social assistance, and studies have shown this is quite regressive because those who enjoy the subsidy for, especially fuel subsidy, is actually not the poorest ones, right? While the poorest ones are, of course, they need the social assistance. So it's quite unfortunate in that regard. So now move to the trade development and policy. I'll start with the general picture of the export and import. You can see actually export and imports of goods and services have increased again. So blue line there is export, red one is imports. So if you add them together, actually Indonesia has around 40% of GDP in trade, right? It's typical for a large country because they have big domestic market. So this one is even bigger than that in China or US, right? But it's much below countries like Vietnam, for example, whose trade to GDP ratio hits 200%, or let alone Singapore, 300%, right? Malaysia, more than 100%. Right? Australia is quite the same with Indonesia, but around 45%. Okay? But the more important one is what's inside these export and import figures, right? So if you see the composition of exports, Indonesia merchandise has increased. That means the role of trade in Indonesia's merchandise production has increased quite a lot, more than 90% recently. But if you look at, again, to the more disaggregated level, we can see here that we are still very reliant on coal, for example, export of coal, right? And the best metal one there with the blue numbers probably reflect the transition from nickel to nickel derivatives, the one thing that I will talk more later on. But the coal here gives an indication that probably the government plan to phase out the coal power plant and things like that is going to be very difficult, right? Next one. Now, I will show you some recent trend in the protectionism. Okay. Back in 2015, when I wrote another paper about trade, actually my argument at that time is that the tariffs has been low across the board and they changed to non-tariff barriers, right? But now you can see that actually even tariff, the blue and the purple line there, has been increasing lately. And the role of non-tariff barrier is actually still very high. So the non-tariff barrier, maybe some of you ask, why is it's non-tariff measure, why do we have the percentage? So that's the tariff equivalent of non-tariff measures, right? So new database have been issued, so we take advantage of that, so we can actually put at the same graph, tariff and non-tariff. The green one there is actually non-tariff measures. And if we decompose the non-tariff measures, we can see that actually the most restrictive ones is the quantity restrictions or quota or ban, right? Which is actually not allowed by WTO. So that's another part of the story today, how Indonesia deals with WTO, okay? And these are the more disaggregate breakdown of the non-tariff measures collected by Global Trade Alert. You can see here Indonesia compared to Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and China. We're quite protectionist, right? Of course, on the last column, China is really, really protectionist, but you can see just in the first row, China actually has so many bailout and state aid, right? But just consider the red ones there, the red numbers. You can see that in terms of investment measure protection and local content requirement, non-tariff measure not otherwise specified, Indonesia is actually really high, even compared to China, right? Now, next is Indonesia participation in the global value chain is still very low, despite the fact that now 2/3 of trade flow in the world actually goes through global value chains. So my argument is that if Indonesia wants to tap this opportunity, they really need to integrate with global value chains. Unfortunately, until now, the participation rate is still quite low. So that's the black bold line there, right? And you can see Vietnam, for example, the green line is actually shooting up very high. So we are left behind by Vietnam in this sense, right? So now, the three phases of trade policy: ambivalence, pragmatism, and nationalism. I should admit that I don't have operational definition of these terms, but I will try to demonstrate that this characterize the interplay of trade policy and industrial policy in Indonesia. So ambivalence can be reflected in Indonesia's implementing. So if you see the GTA, the Global Trade Alert database, you can see the liberalizing measures and the harmful measures. For Indonesia, they increase at the same time, right? So we don't know which one is, is Indonesia becoming more protectionist or becoming more liberalizing at the same time. Furthermore, Indonesia pursues so many trade agreements, FTAs, PTAs, what some call it. But at the same time, Indonesia is also becoming more protectionist, as the previous slides show you, right? And some policies seems to be driven by pragmatism, like omnibus law for job creation, for example. In terms of trade and investment, it's a good law, to my opinion. Of course, there are some notes about that. We can discuss about that more. But often, these policies, when it comes to defending these policies, they use nationalism sentiment, right? For example, this is when the IMF issued a report saying that Indonesia should try to slow down in their downstreaming strategy, right? So the Minister of Investment said that President instructed him to fight for our own country's sovereignty that must not be encroached by anyone. And another minister said that if another country forces us to keep exporting our minerals, then I will call that regulatory imperialism, right? And so I'll use some three recent developments to show the interplay of these three phases. So first, this one is really making splash in the media, right? Successful downstreaming. Well, they claim this is successful, right? So if you see the blue line there, that's the export of nickel ores and concentrates, right? So in 2009, there was a law on coal and minerals mandating that we should not export raw materials. We should convert them domestically to increase domestic value added, right? And then they gave 5 years to to miners to build the smelters. So because of this, they rush to export the raw materials. So you can see from 2009 to 2004, blue line, it increases a lot, right? But they have 5 years. So in 2014, the government issued a regulation said, now it's the time. You have to build smelters, right? So you see the export drops significantly, but then it was proven really hard to build smelters. Capital intensive, and also the government started to feel that, they're not getting enough tax revenue, right? So they said, okay, if you cannot build smelters, you can still export a little bit, but with export tax. So you can see it started to go up again, right? But they now pay tax, which I think is proper thing to do, right? Rather than banning them. But then they said in 2019, well, it's enough. Now we really need to do this, okay? So no more exporting of raw materials. And that's when European Union complained to WTO, right? 2019, they issued, to initiate a hearing in the WTO. 2020, the trial. 2021, it was decided Indonesia lost the case, right? But then we appeal. So now it's pending, okay? We appeal, so now it's pending. We should just wait and see what's gonna happen. But if you see the red line there, that's the nickel and articles thereof. That means it's the derivative, right? So if they cannot export the raw materials, they move to the derivatives, and you can see actually it's shooting up. And this is usually what they claim as the success, because it's really they said the value added increases a lot. Of course, the value added of the red one, but you see the blue one actually was driven to zero, right? So in total, so national value added might not be affected that much, okay? So some points to consider. I think we should also learn from past failures, and that is in the case of locks, in the case of rattan, and some others, right? And this kind of policy actually depresses domestic prices, and that reduces the very rents that can be enjoyed by the owner of very scarce resources like Indonesia, right? And it actually increases the profitability of downstream industries, including smelters, which, by the way, is owned by foreign entities. Okay? So also, we need to consider the intermediate production that is closer to raw materials is typically very capital intensive, which we lack, right? And whereas the segment closer to the final assembly is labor intensive, where we have a lot of labor in this sense, right? So shifting domestic production structure towards the latter, the final assembly, is actually good for enhancing the employment generation, okay? And in the case of resource-rich countries like Indonesia, most major producers export large amount offshore to process because they lack the capability to do that. And domestic demand, the processing capacity is far smaller, so they don't have enough capacity to actually absorb that. Right? That's what happened. And last thing to consider also, Indonesia's withdrawal from the world market may push up the global prices that benefit other exporters. So this is another point that you usually read in the news, saying that, well, we can do this because our nickel is, we are the largest producers of nickel, right? So we should extend it to others. So we can see that one, tin, bauxite, and copper. These are the top three holders of reserves, right? So for bauxite and copper, we're not even in the top three. So the red ones there. For nickel and tin, we're number one in terms of reserves, but for nickel, we're actually the same with Australia. But in terms of production, half of the nickel production in the world actually is Indonesia. And that explains the downstreaming, the success, and so forth. But extending this to other commodities might be more challenging, right? And usually there's another policy that comes with this downstreaming, and that is the local content requirements, or LCR. This is another very popular policy, but this actually runs counter to the goal of joining the global production chains, because GVC, by its very definition, is actually slicing up the task, you know, for everyone. So that means value added, domestic value added necessarily is low, right? So these are some examples. You see the red lines of smartphone, pharmaceutical, and so forth. Of course, some of these might have some justification, for example, in terms of health issues or for Ministry of Health. But another thing that we can see from this slide and the following is that not just one ministry, but so many ministries also are included in this, you know, policy for local content. So there's Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Health, even Bank Indonesia, right? They have this policy. And then Ministry of Industry, of course, President, and Minister of Finance. Minister of Finance, the last sub-item there, it's value-added tax exemption on luxury cars, on the condition that at least 70% of the car's components are manufactured domestically. And if you look at the regulation, the stated objective said to support the local automobile industry affected by the COVID pandemic. It's quite strange, right? Okay, now on our relationship with WTO. These are the number of times we are the complainant, and respondents, and third party. Third party means that if two members are disputing, and then you can be part of the third party to adjudicate, or even if you want to defend one of them, right? So you can see here that Indonesia actually uses its DSM, or dispute settlement mechanism, in WTO quite actively, right? China, of course, it's a lot there, but compared to our neighboring regions, we're not so, we are quite active. But look at Vietnam there. They complain only 5 times. This is since 1995, since the DSM is functioning, all right? Vietnam only complains 5 times, never get complained by anyone. Indonesia got complained 15 times, including the latest one with EU on the nickel downstreaming. these are some examples. Well, these are all Indonesia as a complainant. So the blue one there, we actually won the case, but the red one we lose. The one that we lose for Australia is the packaging of the cigarette. So many countries actually sue Australia, and they all lost. So good, Australia. Okay. And then Indonesia as a respondent there, the red ones, we lost a lot, right? In favor of complaint. And then the last one there, the blue one, that's the EU complaining to Indonesia's downstreaming. They complained in 2019, and then we appeal. A little note on this appeal. Now it's hard and it's pending. Why? Because the appellate body is not functioning anymore. Why? Appellate body, the adjudicator, the last one in the WTO, used to have 7 members, right? And then when Obama came in, 3 expired their terms. And then he did not renew. And then Trump blocked the latest appointment. And now there is no member. So what happens if there's dispute? They go to the temporary arbitration, right? So now I think EU is going to go to that route and then ask Indonesia to comply. But we'll see what's going to happen. But at the same time, Indonesia also engage in or pursue so many FTAs, free trade agreements. You see, under Jokowi's administration, we have so many, right? The blue one there is concluded or signed. The red one is ongoing. The green one is proposed. My point is, there's so many trade agreements that we pursue, while at the same time, we're also becoming protectionist, ambivalent, right? So these are some of the bilateral negotiation, Japan, Pakistan, Palestine, and so forth. The blue one there, it's not, well, as they claim, it's not a simple free trade agreement or preferential trade agreement, which is necessarily being discriminative and all. But usually, the blue one is, the official name has some comprehensive or partnership or very, this is what some of the guys in the World Bank call deep FTA, being usually, according to their study, deep FTA has less trade diversion and more trade creation, meaning it's a good thing, right? But some others and many others actually is very narrow-minded, very preferential based, and necessarily is discriminative to others, right? And the smaller the FTA, the bigger the resulting trade diversion, as Jagdish Bawati remind us. So bilateral agreements can actually cause significant complication one another, right? So we have to be careful with that too. Now, last one. Neraca komoditas, or the balance sheet approach to trade, right? Maybe some of you haven't heard about this. So the president has issued President Regulation number 32 just this, February last year, 2022. So it actually tries, well, the intention there, if you look at the official regulation, they said because before that, if you want to import or export, you have to issue some letter to line ministries. For example, if you want to export or import food item, you have to go to Minister of Agriculture and that get recommendation. And you take that letter of recommendation to Ministry of Trade, and then Minister of Trade will issue you import license, okay? And then you can import. Now they said, that's too much, let's cut this red tape. We don't want recommendation from line ministries again. Let's help the business so we can do it automatically. And in doing so, we need data, right? And they need estimates of demand and supply. The whole country, for commodities, they start with 5 commodities and will expand to other commodities and all commodities. Imagine the headache, right? So for the demand side, they want every firms to report their needs for the next year. And then they plan for production. And by the end of the next year, if it so happens that actually their production is lower than that, they get punished. They cannot get import permit anymore, right? So that's how it works, right? For the supply side, it's still the line ministries have to go to the field, count all this potential production, and based on that, it's neraca, right? Balance sheet, and then if the supply is higher than the demand, you should not import. If the supply is lower than demand, it's Econ 101, right? But applied very dangerously here, okay? Okay, so the immediate problem, of course, data reliability, integrity, and interministerial coordination. It's happening already. They fight one another. And this is just because my time is, I'm good. Okay. So why neraca comunitas is almost impossible to do? So this, from my other paper, so I compare based on statistical, like official statistics, right? So I didn't cook up the numbers, right? So I have the production. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Column 5 is production. Column 7 is, column 4 is consumption. Column 5 is production. So you just take the difference. That's implied excess supply, okay? So if you have excess supply, why then you have so much imports, right? Doesn't make sense. But imports, you take from, again, official statistics, is quite big. So this indicates that you really cannot, make very good estimates on this quantity. And the neraca comoditas is actually based on quantity. So that's really a draconian task to do that, the neraca comoditas. I don't think that's gonna work, okay? So I think there are some better approach to make Indonesia more integrated to the global value chains and trade in general. So to achieve this higher growth target through increased trade activity, I think we should move away from pursuing the activist inward-looking approach to first improving access to cheaper, higher quality inputs, because as you see in the previous table, actually our imports are still dominated by imports of raw materials and capital goods, meaning we really need them for production, including for export purposes, right? And my paper with Desipane showed that actually having higher access to imported inputs actually increases productivity of Indonesian exporters dramatically. So that's a good thing to do. And of course, also to improve, yes, thank you, technology adoption to increase productivity and efficiency. So just so to be practical is to improve the logistics. The reason I also show this, because just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the government was very upset again because our index in the LPI, Logistic Performance Index, dropped to that 3.0, the red one there. And then the government said, this is not fair. We have large number of ports. Singapore only has 1 port. Thus it would be unfair to compare them, right? But then just a very quick Google search, we can find that China has 34 major ports and 2,000 minor ports. And they're higher than us in the LPI, the Logistic Performance Index. And you can see Vietnam there. They overtook us in 2010 in terms of overall Logistic Performance Index. And why is this important for trade? Because these are what trade economists call surface link, right? So infrastructure situation that can support trade activities. Then if you look at the subcomponents of these indexes, actually the worst one related to trade. So this is the sub-index on quality of trade and transport-related infrastructure. So if we can improve this significantly, I think it's going to be very helpful for Indonesia's access to production network and efficiency of customs and clearance process. So those 2 things, right? Infrastructure that supports trade, and efficiency in customs and clearance process. Now, let me wrap up. So Indonesia's approach to trade has been a mix of ambivalence, pragmatism, and nationalism. And recent trade policies, I think they are very intertwined with industrial policy. Maybe I can say that trade policy is there as a byproduct of industrial policy, right? And the restrictive policies prevent Indonesia to gain more from further integration with the global value chains. And instead, what I propose is Indonesia should instead focus on creating a more conducive environment for access to inputs and materials, and on becoming an active player, more active player in the global value chains. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Pakar Cho, and for your insightful and timely presentation, and for championing Australia's WTO success in terms of plain packaging on cigarettes. But I thought also your presentation especially timely, just in the context of Indonesia's recent push to join the OECD, as well as ongoing IPEF negotiations. So thank you very much. I now would like to call on Ibu Masyita to deliver her comments and response. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. So it's hard to talk after Acho, one of my favorite seniors from Depok, on a boring topic, according to Acho, not according to me. So I won't bore you with too much of the details, but I would like to provide, because I cannot comment more on Acho's point of view, a parallel universe, so-called. I'll start with the easy one. So if I see Acho paper is basically talking about the long run. He started with the middle income trap, and the target for Indonesia to be a high income country by 2045, and the way towards there. And then he also talked about a little bit on the short run, on the macroeconomic development, on the global conditions, and also in the Indonesia condition. So the easy part is that in the short run, I think we have a lot of agreements on the conclusion. If you see the global GDP is actually slowing down at the global level. Inflation, even though you see that Acho many wiggly line on the inflation is coming down, but actually a lot of countries are still struggling with inflation, as you can see on the country's inflation on the left of the bar chart. So Indonesia, in terms of growth and inflation, is in a good condition. Why is it important? Because usually when you have an economic recovery, you started inflation going up, and then suddenly you have to start the monetary contractionary, which will then counterfeit what you've already done in the recovery period, which probably hold the economic recovery. So the counter-cyclical policy has been quite successful in Indonesia. It's the biggest bang for the buck, I say, because if you're looking at this chart, is that you see the fiscal deficit in Indonesia is not too bad. We're exceeding the laws stipulating maximum of 3%. However, if you compare to other countries, in the chart, Indonesia is not too bad. On the right-hand side, the debt ratio, the one that's domestically would create a lot of tension, especially this year, it's actually not very bad at all. We have the law that says maximum of 60%. We never exceed 40%, especially after the Asian financial crisis. And if you're looking at the behavior of all Asia or ASEAN countries, like Professor Hill taught me many, many years ago, that they become more prudent after the Asian financial crisis, and it happens now. In fact, domestically, there's discussions of whether you have enough debt, right? So you have two sides of the discussion, whether you're too contractionary and not very putting your feet on the gas for development, and on the contrary, you're also allergic to external debt. If you're looking at Indonesia, it's already plateauing, yeah, but there's a lot behind this line, actually. So, for example, if you see the exchange rate characteristic of the external debt, it's mostly rupiah now, even though it's capital inflow. And we have managed to have different maturities, so not so much in the short run. So the debt structure is also more prudent, let me say, not just the nominal to GDP, but also the structure of the debt is also prudent. Another development after the pandemic is that you probably Indonesians knows that Indonesia's government bond ownership is 40% or sometimes 40% plus owned by foreign. Why this is an issue? Now it's 15%. Thanks to the pandemic, there's a lot of capital inflow and BI is actually buying the government bond. But why is it an important development? Because usually during an economic recovery or there's like a downturn or there's a shock, global shock, there's a lot of outflow that creates rupiah to depreciate in the very short period and then making BI panic and then put a brake on growth, right? So these are the dynamics that we usually have in the short run for Indonesia macroeconomic management. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that I supposed to have the longer one like Acho. In 20 years, potential growth stays at around 5 to 5.2. If you see Acho's previous graph, is actually not much variation in the later years. At least in the 90s after the Asian financial crisis, even though it's at that level, but you somehow have like, you know, movement in the growth, so you know if you're doing counter-cyclical, then growth will move up, right? Now it's like the ocean. You put a counter-cyclical, the growth stays at 5% and not much variability. So this is, I think, a good thing about Indonesia's growth, but if you're looking at trying to be advanced economy, this is probably not a very positive development. Also, I would like to brag a little bit on the macro development because before I start on the long-term issues, is that growth by expenditure and production already come back to the pre-COVID level, even though some areas still need development. Okay. So can the downstreaming be part of the new growth engine? I'll leave that questions to the second part of my commentaries, but at least the downstreaming in the short run is cut the automatic brake of growth that Indonesia usually have. In the old days, before this downstreaming time, whenever growth pick up, current account deficit will widen, you import more, Acho say 40% of GDP, right, including raw materials. And then suddenly rupiah is depreciated, BI has to change the interest rate, and the economy has to go back to the potential. So every time you have a chance to do a leapfrog, exchange rate will change, then you kinda have an automatic break. So at least from the short-term point of view, the current account surplus provided by this downstreaming is helpful in terms of the macro management. Of course, here you'll see, you know, the winners and losers characteristic that Acho mentioned. I pretty much agree with that because where in the value chains and who owns it, right? So who will benefit from a certain policy? But if you're just talking about growth and current account, this is a good policy in the short run. Okay. So I'm not going to repeat the advanced economy story. I'll just focus on the bottom part of the chart. The one that says the distribution of manufacturing within the GDP. This was the target made by Bappenas in order to achieve the advanced economy status. And you know, with the assumption of manufacturing, you're assuming there's innovation in the manufacturing and the job creation. But both of these two variables that makes manufacturing an engine of growth for countries to leapfrog is actually questionable these days. Not because of the downstreaming, but because of the automation, AI, and IoT development. Okay, so if you see side by side, manufacturing growth and GDP, it's pretty much until today is the engine of the movement of growth. So because manufacturing has been declining in proportion of growth, even though you see at the global level, manufacturing as a percentage of global GDP also goes down. In 97, it's around almost 20%. Now it's less than 17%. So it's a tendency globally. But in Indonesia, you can see that the impact of the lowering of the manufacturing capacity is also affecting growth. So Acho also talks about, the local content requirement, the high import content. It is the same story since I was studying in Depok. So nothing much changed. So you have to ask the next one, what engine of growth should Indonesia make in order to leapfrog to be an advanced economy? Can we still rely on manufacturing like the South Korea and Taiwan development? I doubt that it can be happen because now we have automation, AI and IoT, where manufacturing is no longer creating a high quality jobs with a premium salary. I would like to offer a deeper analysis, Mas Acho, on this.
Influence downstreaming policy in Indonesia? Is it a kind of resource cost or that caused the industrializations and middle income traps? And and then the second question is from Yogi Vidyatama from the University of Canberra, addressed to both speakers. Would you mind to comment on the debate between Faisal Basri and Septian Haryo Seto regarding who actually got the benefit from nickel downstreaming? And please extend your discussions to medium and long-term impact as well. Thank you.
Okay. First, from Budy, business oligarchy. I cannot really answer that, but I suggest you to download the dissertation of Dr. Eve Warburton. And to Yogi, commenting on, so just a context to our audience here. So there's been a splash in the media going on back and forth between noted economist Pak Faisal Basri and one of the staff of coordinating Minister of Marine and Investment about this downstreaming, right? So according to Pak Faisal Basri, this strategy is not benefiting Indonesia at all. It is actually benefiting China, right? And then the response from the government office staff said that, well, first, it increases the value added significantly. It created jobs. It actually generated tax income from the derivative and things like that, right? What do I think about that? I think that's a healthy debate, of course, for one. Second, I think I have some sympathy to Pak Faisal Basri's opinion, because if the main objective of the downstreaming is to have all the value added in Indonesia, that's not happening at the moment, right? Because the big investors, they comply with the law to convert the nickel into NPI, but because the domestic capacity cannot absorb the proceeding, like the adjacent product of that, they have to go out. Otherwise, it's just a waste, right? So they go out, and then it happens that they 90% go to China, right? So think about a production process from A, B, C to E, right? A being nickel ore, E being, say, a car. So B is to convert the nickel ore into some kind of adjacent derivative, say nickel pig iron or nickel mate, right? C is rolled coil, right? Rolled coil, and D is stainless steel. And then you have car. If you want to have this all within the country for, in order to increase domestic value added, you have to have capital, expensive machine and all that, which we don't, right? So now we are successful in going from A to B, so NPI, right? So now the government said that let's think about banning the export of NPI now. So it goes again to coil, right? But the coil industry, we don't have one in Indonesia, right? So stainless steel actually imported the coil to produce the stainless steel, right? So there was a case in Indonesia just recently where Samsung from Korea, they had to withdraw their refrigerator and washing machine line from Indonesia because according to the this downstreaming and local content requirements, they no longer is allowed to import the steel for their refrigerator and the washing machine, right? They have to source it from domestic companies in Indonesia. But there is no one that made it. So they have to go out. Now they only have one line in Indonesia, and that is smartphone. And it's also interesting in the case of smartphone, right? So smartphone, as I show you in the table, also have this very stringent local content requirements. So what happened? There is Oppo, right? Firman's handphone there. So Oppo come to Indonesia, and Oppo being able to capture economies of scale, they created all the chargers that are compatible with other phones, right? And that chargers, because they are made in Indonesia, it's complying with the local content requirements. So Oppo is happy, Samsung and other smartphone industry use that as a way to comply with this regulation. But not all commodities can do that, right? I mean, in terms of that refrigerator and washing machine, it's proven already some of these investors go out because they can no longer serve the market because of the requirement. So I think I give you a long answer to that question, but I hope you have an idea, Yogi.
Time's up. Okay. Hi, Max Yogi. I just want to say hi. You're asking short-term, medium to long-term. There's no short answer for this, but definitely in the short run, I can see the argument coming from the government because it does shows in our macro data and trade data and also our tax revenue data. So it does have a short-term impact. The medium-term to long-term, whatever you protect is going to be more innovative outside as well, right? Like the battery, they can no longer use lithium, can use sodium, for example, in the future, or, you know, there's a lot of other innovation that you can do. But also as the dominant producer of a certain goods, Indonesia can actually form alliances with countries, not only on the same goods with Australia, but also with the goods that are complementary to our production in order to create a final goods, right? So this is an era of, another new era of trade where it's not going directly to China, it might go to Indonesia. Acho presentation shows that Indonesia doesn't get really the advantage of the global value chain. It's not an easy thing to get into the global value chain. For example, like India trying to get into the iPhone value chain, they only get the assembly. So it's a very low value added towards the end. So even countries like India with probably better education and some part has a better human capital on IT and those more advanced skill set, it's not very easy to micromanage an economy and a line of production. So I think the jury is still out, but I always, the minister and the cabinet always ask, so what are the alternative then? We need to start somewhere. There's a pluses and minuses in all policy. There's always winners and losers. You just have to make sure that the losers are well compensated. The aspiring middle class, the bottom 40% is getting what they need in terms of economic volatility. And then you can put a guess on some of the policy that might not be very popular to the academic community or also to advanced economies opinion. Thank you.
So thank you to both our speakers, and Budy, 4 minutes over time isn't too bad. So very, very interesting and greatly appreciated to both of you. And I think especially interesting in the context of media reports of President Widodo's upcoming visit to the United States in November particularly around downstreaming issues. So thank you very much. I think this panel, it's done its job. You're on time, and I think we're all better informed. So thank you. So please put your hands together for Ibu Achu and Ibu Masyita. Thank you. Thank you. Now it's time for lunch. We're ready to break. Student volunteers will be outside the theatre to accompany people to Friday prayers, should they wish. Take a walk around the campus, enjoy the sun, the beautiful weather. And you can also purchase lunch at the Cambry section of the campus. But please return to your seats no later than 1 p.m. Much appreciated, and thank you very much.
Let's start our session. My name is Budy Resosudarmo. I am currently the head of Indonesia project. And I would like to mention the following. As we meet here today to attend the 40th Indonesia update, I would like to acknowledge and remember two giants in the field of Indonesian studies. First, we remember Peter McCauley, a distinguished development economist, former head of Indonesia Project, and founder of this Indonesia Update conference. So we are here because he and Professor Jamie Mackey start these activities. Second, we also remember Professor Harold Crouch, eminent scholar of Indonesian politics and a dedicated supervisor of many PhD students who become prominent scholar of Indonesia, including Professor Ed Espinal and Marcus Michener. We remember both Peter and Harold with a warm smile and thank them both for the incredible contribution they made to build a bridge between Australia, Indonesia, and the countries in our region. But above all else, we recognize and celebrate their commitment to those they taught, mentor, and work with. Thank you, Peter and Harold.